So I did a post on my community tab asking you guys what you wanted to see for the next rough guide video, and I could only put 5 options there. But with 858 votes on the overall poll and a score of 28%, death metal won the rough guide poll. With that being said, you guys can head over to my community tab or keep posted on that because I post a lot of stuff over there. I always post when I upload new videos, new content. I also put polls up for you guys to influence the content, and I have based numerous videos on your guys' comments on these things, so definitely go over there if you're interested in seeing what's coming up for the channel as well as new uploads, and you can help make new videos. So death metal, where did it get shit out from? What sewer drain did it come out of? Where did Pennywise cook up this abomination? Well, it started in the early 80s, but we actually have to go a little bit further back technically to the roots of thrash metal, speed metal. In the 1970s, there was a little bit of a push for a lot of heavy metal bands to make this offshoot known as speed metal, which was basically a kind of difficult to explain genre, which was heavy metal that tested its limits of speed, of intensity, of aggression, and it was mostly known by Judas Priest and specifically Motorhead. And honestly, Motorhead was kind of like the George Washington of extreme metal, because Motorhead influenced not just death metal, but black metal, grindcore, and specifically thrash metal, which is another major place that death metal found its roots. You were getting bands like Slayer and like Venom that were bursting on the scene, as well as Exodus. Thrash metal on its own was a pretty raw and primal style at the time. I mean, if you look back at a record like Kill 'Em All by Metallica, it was pretty raw in the grand scheme of things. The production was not really that smoothed out, and it would be considered raw in the contemporary scene compared to how produced a lot of other heavy metal bands were in that contemporary scene. But Slayer specifically decided to say, fuck you all, fuck the big four, fuck all of like Germany, let's just be as heavy as humanly possible. And they were much more confrontational, much more in your face and primal and aggressive, and so that was a big influence on extreme metal. But Venom, ooh, Venom, they were pretty much just like, alright then, let's see how far we can take it, mate. And that they did, and people still to this day love to debate whether Venom or Bathory invented black metal. But did you know that Venom is actually the band that coined the term black metal? We're not talking about black metal, we're talking about death metal. And Venom was instrumental in the foundation of black metal and death metal, showing a level of intensity in the production and the vocals and the instrumentation. But it kind of just came with the territory that heavy metal artists were always trying to innovate the genres that they played in, and that kind of led to, if they were the big tree, then all of these little branches came out. So that kind of resulted in black metal, death metal, grindcore, gore grind, all of these different genres coming about, thrash metal as well. But the two bands that kick-started death metal, and once again, kind of like Bathory and Venom, we have our own who came first, the chicken or the egg sort of thing, with Possessed and Death. We had the two albums Scream Bloody Gore and Seven Churches, which laid the foundation and framework for what death metal would be to this day, and there are still about 1 million bands that are trying to suck off the dick of the legacy of Chuck Schuldiner and want Daddy Jeff Becerra's approval. I swear to God, if I have to hear like one more band that is just sucking off the past, which we will get into like how bad death metal is obsessed with the past, I will literally take this bat and I will beat someone's fucking head in. YouTube, that was a joke. Do not demonetize me. It's all a gimmick. It's all in good fun. That's a joke. It's a prank, bro. Please don't demonetize me. They were influenced by these contemporary bands that took violence and intensity and speed to the extreme, and death metal started alongside a variety of other extreme metal genres that were testing the limits of how far extreme metal could go. Grindcore was getting its start, Carcass was starting gore grind on their own accord, as well as thrash metal started to become heavier and heavier, and death metal was sort of like a sister genre of sorts to black metal, as they both started pretty much smack dab at the same time. Similarly to black metal at the time, most of the production kind of felt a little DIY. Maybe not as shrill or as brittle as black metal, but it definitely was towing the line of conventional production techniques and took on a very DIY approach. And let's just say that death metal from there turned into a whole thing, but out of the band names that you'll usually hear, whether you're talking about Cannibal Corpse, Obituary, Autopsy, Morbid Angel, Necrophagus, Possessed, there were projects that were trying to take even death metal, in its infancy in many ways, into new directions and different offshoots from death metal itself. It did not take long for that genre to innovate from its own innovation. And I feel like y'all know what I'm about to say. It was Death, whose discography read like the stepping stones of what would later be technical death metal, its own massive subgenre of death metal. A direct contrast to people trying to make death metal sound unpolished, no frills, no bullshit, straight in your face, blood and guts, that sort of thing, and taking it in more of a direction where it was progressive, where the BPM was faster, where it could be better produced. But speaking of death, there was a music scene within death metal that would gradually take hold and become the most influential portion of the death metal community, the Florida death metal scene, specifically Tampa Bay. And on my notes thing, I have like the list of just some of the biggest bands, and I don't even know if right off the bat a lot of people would know that a lot of these bands came from Florida, but you have Cannibal Corpse, who ended up moving obviously, but Monstrosity, Death, Morbid Angel, Atheist, Obituary, Cynic, Assoc, Paths of Possession, 6 Feet Under, Massacre, Solstice, the list goes on. In the same way that people are like, why are there so many like specific rappers of a specific style from Detroit? Or why did like the entire fucking grunge scene come from Seattle, Washington of all places? The Florida death metal scene, specifically Tampa Bay, was massively influential to the foundation of death metal as well as its innovation. A lot of these bands would take what death metal was supposed to be, a primordial thing that was just so aggressive and unrestrained, and tried to temper it down with more progression, more nuance to their composition, with bands like Nocturnus, Death, and Cynic showing that the primal roots the genre came from didn't have to be the end-all be-all, and testing the limits of how unorthodox you could play death metal and still make great music. Now, visually and lyrically, death metal had something that heavy metal had definitely fucked with a little bit, and it was kind of embedded in the culture, but death metal loved to be shock and awe. They loved a gimmick. They loved making their album covers as grotesque as possible, and there were certainly bands that took this to the extreme. Bands like Cannibal Corpse come to mind, and also having this obsession with like horror and slasher film type of stuff and very Z-list horror type vibes. And at first it's kind of one note, distorted, it's kind of one-dimensional, palm muted sort of technique, was fairly simplistic compared to a lot of the contemporary genres at the time, with grindcore and gore grind testing the limits of what noise and aggression could do, thrash metal and speed metal testing like straight speed, as well as black metal testing how shrill you could make something and how evil and blackened you could make something. Death metal definitely was in a lane of its own, and it kind of opened itself up to catch a stride and kind of become popular in a little way. And by the early 1990s, death metal had not only found its proper footing and identity, experimentation was officially widespread, and the notoriety and publicity of death metal had become pretty widespread. Death metal was moving up in the world, and it was no longer a genre that was simply regarded as this little underground micro movement that not that many people knew about unless you were in the scene. MTV was instrumental in this, showing bands like Morbid Angel, classic bands like Napalm Death and Death themselves, as well as Cannibal Corpse, being reacted to by Beavis and Butthead, which I don't think y'all can understand that Beavis and Butthead was South Park levels at its peak of notoriety and people seeing it, so those were tens of millions of people seeing that. And we even got to the point to where Jim Carrey on a live talk show talked about Napalm Death, shouted them out, and did guttural vocals live on television. And I know that people might not understand how big of a deal that was at the time with how big Jim Carrey was. It should be pretty apparent, but nowadays celebrities liking heavier music or wearing metal shirts or whatever it may be, it's really not that uncommon, or at least it's not something that's frowned upon or like an oh my god moment. It may get like a headline, but outside of that, it's not really a big deal outside of a little publicity stunt on Loudwire. So at the time when metal was still in this infant stage in a way where it was very primal and it wasn't really talked about or discussed and had a lot of stereotypes attached to it, it was a big deal to have a celebrity do this. Because I know we kind of take for granted that listening to metal now in the grand scheme of things, it's not really that strange, and people most of the time aren't going to frown upon you or question you. They might raise some eyebrows, but it was not always that way. And death metal for being so shocking and out there. I know black metal caught its reputation, especially in like the Norwegian scene and the church burnings and stuff, and how satanic and openly anti-Christian it was. Death metal was shocking in its own way, and it pushed you away in its own way. But death metal wasn't done there. While there was still a great underground, there were a lot of other little micro genres that were bubbling up to the surface. You had death and roll, death doom, as well as death grind, which pretty much just took the death metal formula and mixed it with another big genre. And these genres are still to this day kicking ass, going hard, and are pretty notorious in the metal community. But I specifically want to highlight two of the most important: technical death metal and melodic death metal. Technical death metal was obviously inspired by bands like Death, but nowadays we don't really think much about the BPM testing. But there was a time in death metal where experimentation was not necessarily frowned upon, but wasn't really assumed, and the bands that did it were considered pushing the envelope and boundary pushing. And now we don't really question if we get a band like Archspire that goes at like 1,000 BPM, but there was a time when it wasn't really like that. And let's move out of America for a second. We're going over to the Swedes, baby! Swedish death metal, specifically the Gothenburg scene, was massively instrumental in the foundation of what is known as melodic death metal, or melodeath. The Gothenburg metal scene, similarly to how Tampa Bay, Florida had a scene that took death metal in its own direction, had a heavy concentration of bands that was taking death metal in an entirely new direction. Death metal didn't need to be non-stop relentless anymore. You could have production that sounded good. Oh my heavens, that was brand new. So you had big names like Dark Tranquility, In Flames, At the Gates, like the big three, Amon Amarth, Soilwork, Arch Enemy, showing that you could expand a composition past the confinements of just blood and guts, and death metal could not only be harmonious and beautiful, but still maintain the hallmarks that make the genre what it was to begin with. And I will say, while America does experiment a lot with styles, I think that people sleep on the European death metal scene, because the European death metal bands never strayed away from making something experimental. I mean, look at Venom. They pretty much started everything, and they were English. Even like the gore grind OG classics, Carcass just deciding to make some classic melodic death metal records as well. And while not solely a melodic death metal band, or even a death metal band as a whole, Opeth opened the door up for so many new metal fans and was a great gateway, even though they are kind of a clusterfuck of a band in their own right. And then 2001 happened, and Chuck Schuldiner died, and this was a very big deal in the metal community. This was one of the first times that we had lost such a big name in metal that really shook the foundation of what the genres were, especially considering he was taken from us so soon, and Death was still a phenomenal band in every sense of the word that innovated everything. And death metal doesn't really have that many standout vocalists that a lot of people know by name. I mean, you got your Jeff Becerras and Corpse Grinder and, you know, Chuck Schuldiner, but this definitely was a very big turning point, and so many bands came to honor death and how they approached their songwriting. And I know it's kind of a grim and morbid subject that a lot of people don't want to talk about, but I do doubt that if Chuck didn't die, I don't think we would have gotten a lot of the tech death bands and the bands that took Death's formula and tried to build upon the stones that they set out for them. And obviously, you know, it would be incredible to still have Chuck here, and he was taken from us way too soon, but regardless of that, it is what it is, and it did influence a lot of bands, so I had to say it. Nowadays, death metal is in a position where it's never the most popular on the block, but it's never the least popular on the block. There are so many flourishing death metal genres that have so many different little microorganisms working in them, and all these little micro labels, and all of the subgenres that I talked about in this video are not only still existing, but bigger than ever. Now, death metal kind of nowadays does have a little bit of an issue of being obsessed with the past. There is the OSDM revival, where old school death metal is becoming new school death metal, with a lot of bands trying to have this very mud-caked old school style and take it back to its primal roots. They don't fuck with the experimentation, they don't fuck with the production techniques or making something super progressive. They want that blood and guts, meat and potatoes sound, that sort of Cannibal Corpse type of style, and that's perfectly fine. And we still have a bunch of great bands making great material. Possessed made a record like a while back, I know it was years ago, and we still have Napalm Death in the 2000s and 2010s doing awesome. I know they're also like a grindcore band, and Cannibal Corpse, Obituary, Obituary, Autopsy, there are fantastic bands that are still kicking ass to this day. But my voice hurts. What are your guys' opinions of death metal? Do you like it? What's your favorite offshoots? What's your favorite bands? Post it all down below. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is, my name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.